A day after Saudi Arabia began airstrikes against the Houthi militia forces in Yemen, the embattled President Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi has now fled to Saudi Arabia and has been embraced by both the political and military leadership there. At the same time, regional powers are trading threats back and forth, and even President Obama is being blamed for the airstrikes by a few opportunistic politicians in the United States. But first, since we didn't get to cover it yesterday, this is according to Reuters. Starting yesterday, warplanes from Saudi Arabia and Arab allies struck Shiite Muslim rebels fighting to oust Yemen's president on Thursday. Saudi-owned Al Arabiya TV reported that the kingdom was contributing 100 warplanes to Operation Storm of Resolve, which I believe was named by George W. Bush, and more than 85 were provided by the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Morocco, and Sudan. We have some more information about some of the contributions of these regional allies. Jordan and Sudan said their forces were involved in the operation. Egyptian air forces were participating, and 4 naval ships headed to secure the Gulf of Aden. And Pakistan was considering a request to send ground forces as well. And when Iran made a few statements basically saying that although they are not going to become militarily involved in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or the internal politics of Yemen, Pakistan responded to that, saying that they would counter any Iranian aggression. Now, they're not currently sending any ground forces, and neither is Iran, but what seemed like a few airstrikes at first as the day went on has become a larger and larger conflict that has wrapped up most of that region and is now impacting even U.S. Domestic politics.
Okay, now this is a super important story because I believe this is signaling the beginning of the broader war. But before we get to that, we have to acknowledge, as John pointed out, Storm of Resolve is a hell of a name.
Yeah, it's also going to be the 6th Game of Thrones book.
Yeah,
it's gonna be awesome.
I'm torn as to whether it's cool because it's a Storm of Resolve, or it's a little weird, like Storm of Resolve. Like, what are we resolving? I don't, and it doesn't roll off the tongue. Storm of Resolve. I like resolution. I like it seems strong, and there's a storm.
Storm's
right.
Storm is an active verb. Resolve seems very complacent, right? Things are over, so you can't storm it over. It's like a contradiction in terms. Maybe that's why.
I think that they mean resolve as in they have resolve. They have willpower, but you're
Against
right. There's other
Islam.
meanings. So it's like storm of negotiation.
Yeah.
Like
Storm of compromise.
which would be kind of cool. I've never seen a storm of compromise.
The next
Anyway.
Democratic president's campaign slogan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
of course, a lot might be lost in translation, I suppose.
no, of course. And then when John was saying the president's name, I thought he was stumbling when he's like, no, the beginning of his name is Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi. Okay. Anyway, all right. Now on to the super important part of the story. Look, there's been a lot of proxy battles throughout the Middle East between Shiites and Sunnis. And this is bringing it to a whole different level because here is a different country, not the United States, Saudi Arabia going into another kind of sovereign country at this point, Yemen, and saying, we don't like that the Shiites are taking over. We're going to intervene in your civil war. And we're going to bring all these other Sunnis with us. And thereby challenging Iran and possibly igniting a broader Sunni-Shia war throughout the entire Middle East. I mean, obviously...
It really depends on how Iran responds. I mean, they've been lending support to the Hadi, but are they going to send planes? Are they going to engage Saudi Arabian forces? That seems unlikely today.
They say they won't.
They say they won't. But they could well be arming the rebels as we speak.
No, and whether they're arming the rebels is a different question, right? And so here's the thing about Iran. They're sneaky, okay? It's true. So they haven't started any wars, and that's also true, okay? On the other hand, they fund Hezbollah from time to time, Hamas, and then the guys in Yemen, it's likely that they're funding them, although, to be fair, there isn't overwhelming evidence on that at this point. And so they're spurring Shias on, and especially in Iraq, and especially in Syria now. And they're egging them on. But then they go around and go, what, us? We didn't do anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I got no troops in Syria. I got no troops in Iraq. So they're the guys who are honestly like, come up to you, punch you, and then when you go, what? They're like, what are you doing? What do you mean? What do you mean? Why are you grabbing me? Yeah, why are you grabbing me?
Getting so excited.
Right.
Why are you grabbing me?
So, now, having said that, I don't think they're going to come into Yemen. They say they're not coming into Yemen, and it'd be a hell of a thing to get Iranian troops into Yemen, especially in the middle of negotiations with the U.S., et cetera. They usually handle it in a more covert way. But if the Saudi bombing ignites a storm of resolve in the opposite direction from Shias that live in Yemen, and then that continues to spread, it doesn't have to spread much further. I mean, it's already in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, that Shia-Sunni conflict. It could be a whole different level of ugly in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So but for years, when Saudi Arabia wanted to bomb somebody, they just called the United States.
Yep.
And then we would go bomb them, and at the same time, they would give public speeches condemning the United States.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
it was this. So at least maybe that's ending. We're kind of halfway done fighting proxy wars for Saudi Arabia. Why do you think now Saudi Arabia decided to step up? Is it because the United States wouldn't do what they wanted to do?
Yes. So here's my take on it, and then I'm curious what you think, John. It's the U.S. is saying, hey, look, we're in the middle of negotiations with Iran on their nuclear program. That's very important. We care more about that than anything else because their nuclear program could do more damage, right? Now, the other problem is that we're working with Iran in Iraq against ISIS. Remember, ISIS is Sunni.
Yeah.
And then you've got Al-Qaeda, who we hate as well, who's also Sunni.
Yeah.
We've worked with Iran in the past against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, sometimes in Iraq. Now we're definitely working with them in Iraq against ISIS. So we don't want to go and punch Iran in the face while we're trying to do a deal with them and while we're actually cooperating with them in Iraq. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has completely different priorities. Their priorities are, look, under no circumstances am I having Shias on my border, and Yemen is a significant border with Saudi Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula, having them take over that country. I'm not having
An
it.
amorphous, difficult to patrol border.
That's right.
Where there is literally no border. It's hundreds of miles of you don't know what country it is actually.
Yeah, and then the final part of that puzzle, and I know it's getting confusing, and that's part of the problem here, which is that everybody's fighting one another in the Middle East, and it's a gigantic mess, is Saudi Arabia doesn't mind Al-Qaeda that much. A lot of the people within the Saudi power structure probably funded Al-Qaeda, right? Now, they're a big ally of ours. They give us a lot of oil, so we try to hush that up, and we attack Iraq, which they thought was going to help them. It turns out otherwise, right? Saudi Arabia was in favor of that move. But anyway, Al-Qaeda, they don't mind as much. But ISIS, which is Sunni, which the Saudis originally were like, like some badass Sunnis, we kind of like that, go get the Shias. And then when ISIS said, we'd also like Saudi Arabia, they were like, what is this? And they started building a giant wall on their border to keep ISIS out. So now the Saudis are saying, well, I like that the Shia are helping us against ISIS in Iraq, but I'm still not having them on my border. So I get why U.S. is not bombing, but I'm going to go bomb Yemen.
I think all of that is true. All of that, I think, could motivate them to want to fight the Houthis in Yemen. But I think on top of it, too, as sort of an added bonus, we've talked often about how much military support Saudi Arabia has gotten over the past couple of decades from the United States. But we've also talked about how they receive all these weapons, these jets, F-16s, all of that stuff, but they haven't been able to put it into practice very much. So we doubt their training. And what better training than to actually use it, not in exercises, but in war? So you get two things from sending all of your pilots to bomb Yemen. You get to actually provide them real-world combat experience, and you also get ISIS on the other side of the northern border saying, oh, maybe Saudi Arabia actually could defend themselves against this. It's a show of strength while you're actually blowing up parts of Yemen. I think that could provide some extra benefits to the Saudi leadership.
Yeah. Now, two more things to make this slightly more dangerous and more confusing. Now, in the latest article I just read before the show, Turkey is providing logistical help to Saudi Arabia against the Shia in Yemen. Now, Turkey is very secular, very much on the side of the United States. Now, they disagreed on the Iraq War, but normally they're usually in lockstep, right? Turkey is not Saudi Arabia. Turkey is not Pakistan. When you have Pakistan and Turkey, which are pretty tangential to the Middle East, joining a Saudi-led effort in the Middle East against the Shias, that means we have got a Sunni-Shia war on our hands globally.
Yeah.
And That's a disaster.
The important thing is that we get 100,000 U.S. troops in the middle of it as soon as possible.
Right. Exactly. Oh my God, who the hell are we fighting? So let me add to the last part of the confusion and why Jimmy and a lot of Americans are right. Like, don't go in the middle of that mess, as John was just saying. So in this case, Saudi Arabia is really good allies with Israel because they're both concerned about Iran. Because Saudi Arabia is concerned because they're Shia, and they're helping Shia rebels in Yemen, which are right on their border. So they're mortal enemies with Iran. Israel's concerned if they get the nukes, oh my God, they might use it against Israel. So Israel and Saudi Arabia, in this strange turn of events, well, if you follow that region, it's not as strange as it sounds, are now pretty top allies in trying to push the United States against making a deal with Iran because they'd like further war where they wipe out the Shia. Don't do that. It's a really difficult situation we're in. It's a super tough balancing act. But don't just go and attack Iran because Saudi Arabia wants you to and Israel wants you to. We've got to be really smart here because if we get into the middle of this mess, imagine if we attacked Iran and then we got ISIS on one side and the entire Shia population of the world on the other side, both attacking us.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine a larger disaster.